Hello all, so I was going to do a different video today, but I've instead decided, since it's topical, that I will talk about the climate, because of course I have some opinions on the climate. Now, having said that, this video will probably be pretty boring, and the reason for that is that the climate, it's not a very interesting topic, and the simple reason for that is because the actual science is settled, the reality of the problem is undeniable. So that's kind of boring, there's not really any point talking about that. And also the solutions are kind of obvious, at least the big solutions. This isn't some interesting take. Especially, I don't know, you compare it to last video. The last video I did in this channel was me responding to an argument which I'd never really seen anybody sufficiently respond to before. So I felt the need to come out and introduce that argument to the world. This is not that. This is basically just talking about the most obvious stuff. But, I figured I'd do it. It's kind of funny because the actual video I was planning on making today would have been dramatically more controversial, but we're doing this instead. First of all, I just want to make a comment on how I often see this topic being discussed, especially by kind of socialists, but Twitter socialists. Basically kind of left-wing populists who you get the impression their populism is more just oh man, they just speak the truth, man. You don't really get the impression that actually they have any kind of academic rigor to any of their beliefs. Sean Head is a good example. Anyway, and I don't dislike Sean Head, but I will say a lot of the time when I find myself interacting with a kind of particularly abusive transgender identity extremist account, I go onto their thing and I see that they're followed by Sean Head. That's the most I do follow Sean Head, and the main thing that I've taken out of it is that Sean Head follows a lot of really shitty trans-identified people. So make of that what you will. Anyway, basically what I want to talk about is how there's kind of two different opinions I see, and I think they're both wrong. The first one is the people who act as if climate change is something which you can kind of do as an individual. That really what you're doing as an individual is even relevant to climate change. The people who say, oh, you should recycle more, you should have a vegan diet, or at least eat less meat. You should drive less and cycle more and all that kind of stuff. And obviously that's wrong. Obviously your individual, and the thing is, this isn't even voting, where, because obviously with voting, a single vote isn't going to make a difference. But at least there's kind of I don't know if this is the correct term, but prisoner's dilemma going on there, where you don't actually know what other people are doing. So it's at least you can delude yourself into believing that there's a chance your vote could be the determining vote. You could be oh, yeah, sure, maybe this election will be decided by one vote, even though it obviously won't. But at least there's that aspect. Whereas with taking individual action to prevent climate change, you know that you're not making a difference because you know what everyone else is doing. I just find it very strange when individuals become vegan for climate change reasons, environmentalist reasons, and it's but you literally know that you're not actually solving any problem. And I will say this on veganism, I'm going to make a whole video on veganism at some point. But I'll say this, I kind of consider myself, I almost use the term political vegan. And what I mean by that is I support veganism as a policy, as a government policy. If there was a referendum on making it so everybody has to be vegan, I would vote yes. But I have no interest in veganism as a lifestyle choice because it doesn't achieve anything as a lifestyle choice. So, that's just my take very briefly. But yeah, I think this in broad terms, this whole idea of, oh, just make life worse for yourself, deny yourself things, put more obligations upon yourself so that you can fix climate change. It's but you know that that's not going to happen. You know that your individual decision isn't going to change it. Now, having said that, there is the alternative position, because that's kind of the hyper kind of neoliberal individualist position, which is, obviously terrible. Individualists are just the worst. But there's also the other position, which, like I say, is kind of the Twitter socialist position, which is oh man, it's all the corporations, it's just the corporations, and you get these statistics corporations are responsible for 99% of, it's never 90, but it's a lot, responsible for this massive percentage of all of the problems with the climate. And it's just on the surface level, does that even make sense? Because it's if you say corporations are responsible, sure, but surely corporations aren't, they're made up of individuals. And even if you're saying, what are you saying, that the small number of individuals who are in a position, because if this is supposed to be a socialist message, then obviously you presumably can't be including the workers for these corporations, because that would just be silly. That wouldn't, at that point, like, you're not really blaming the corporations as an entity, you're blaming the workers. So if you're saying like, oh, it's this one individual at the top who is personally using all of the fossil fuels and all of that, or are you saying it's that these corporations provide a service to the individuals? Like, when somebody says corporations are responsible for huge amounts of environmental issues, I'm not even sure what they mean, because it's like, if you're saying that corporations are responding to public demand, then I don't think you can really say they're causing it. You would surely say that the public demand is what's causing it. Basically, it just seems to me weird to blame corporations. I think there are a lot of people who just want to blame other people for everything, and therefore this idea that actually it's all the corporations and you just need to solve, it's like the people who actually think that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have billions of dollars, and the people who say like, oh, if we just took some of their billions of dollars that they've got lying around, because after all, the billions of dollars they're worth, that's not an expression of the value of the assets they own, that's actually the cash money that they have. If we just took that cash from them, we could use it to solve world hunger. Like those people, the people who literally have no idea how the economy works. They're the kind of people who they basically want to have, like, I don't know why they even want this, but they want to have like maybe like 5 people max who they can blame for all the world's problems. Like, just if you get like these 5 people and I don't know, you whatever, tax them, do something to them, suddenly like there's no more climate change, there's no more poverty, I don't know, probably like no more problems with healthcare, maybe no more systemic injustice of any kind. Like there's, and again, this is kind of that, like I say, and it's part of the broad kind of lame left-wing populism. And it's like, I mean, heck, is it populism? Literally, their whole take is just, you know what? Everybody's fine. Nobody's responsible for any problems. It's basically, you don't have to worry if you're like somebody who's, like a upper middle class person living way beyond like, extreme amounts of decadence, who own like 3 cars. You spend huge amounts of money on stuff you don't really need. You're not the problem with inequality in the world. No, the actual problem is like 5 guys who just have too much stuff. And it's, I don't know. It's, like I say, I mean, heck, is it populism? It's like, oh, don't worry. The vast, like 99.99999% people are absolutely fine. It's just there's like 5 guys who are responsible for all the evil in the world. And yeah, I guess you can tell, I don't think that's a particularly intelligent thing to say, and I just find this whole narrative of like, don't blame people, blame the corporations, very silly. And with that said, I mean, so how would I think about it? Well, I would think basically it's a collective thing, right? It's not this kind of individualism where you say like, oh, it's just every individual needs to make the decision to do the right thing. But it's also not the kind of, I mean, in a way, weirdly, like this particular type of left-wing populism almost is like a new form of individualism, but it's just like you're only concerned with like 5 individuals who you perceive to be at the top of society and responsible for all the world's problems. It's not that either. It's everybody collectively, and the solution is government, right? It's government action. It's I mean, the big thing really when you talk about the environment, it's infrastructure, which requires huge amounts of like cooperation. It's basically, I mean, the thing is obviously like environmentalism as a concern is basically the big thing that completely means that, it's one of the many reasons why being a libertarian is complete nonsense. But yeah, basically it's an example of where actually having people work together and having a situation where people are basically forced by government mandate to consider just beyond their own immediate interests is good. And obviously this is things like people being charged more in tax. That's the thing which needs to be enforced top down. It's also a thing which needs to apply broadly to all of society. Like, obviously we should have a progressive income tax, but that's the point. Like, sure, it should hit, the wealthier people more, but it should still hit like lots of other people as well. Let's not play that stupid 99% of people don't really have anything they should feel any obligation to contribute to the betterment of society game that a lot of socialists like to play. No, it should basically spread the burden quite evenly and in order to fund basically infrastructure, which when you look at that, I mean, it's first of all, it's going to affect everybody. Like that's pretty obvious. And secondly, obviously, it's going to involve like a large number of people. It's going to involve workers and stuff like that. And that's going to have impacts. It's a big thing. And I just think like you need to understand it purely from a collectivist mindset, which sucks because people aren't collectivist anymore, it seems. Everybody's caught the neoliberal individualist bug. And I'm just sat there thinking like I'm the only person who's just a hardcore collectivist. And yeah, I mean, if I was to define my politics in like one word, it would possibly even be collectivist, because that's really what I'm about. Anyway, that's what I'm saying. That's how we should conceive of like the fight against climate change. It's a collective effort. The other thing I really don't like about when people talk about climate change is people who talk about it as like a hypothetical future catastrophic event. And I think it's because it doesn't work. Like, I just think people just don't believe that. Like when you say, oh, there's going to be this massive event in the future where, I don't know, it's going to be a big tidal wave and it's going to smash London into a million pieces. People don't believe that. The thing is, like, the proper way to talk about climate change, I think, is to talk about, like, the smaller annoyances that are happening right now, which, by the way, I think is probably more accurate. Like, when I think about climate change, I don't really think about, like, the world ending. Like, I'm genuinely, I mean, heck, maybe if you like, by some people's standards, I'm a climate change denier. I don't think there's, like, an apocalypse situation around the corner. I really don't. I'm not scared. Like the people, I don't know, and this is an example where I'm not an anti-natalist either. The people who think like humanity's going to end and it's, going to be, like I say, like a post-apocalypse situation, I think that's nonsense. But what I do think is that it's just going to be worse, right? Like there's going to be less food and food's going to get more expensive. I'm not, when I say that's the thing, it's not necessarily like, oh, people are going to start starving and they're going to start eating each other and, they're going to start hunting their own children for food. No, but like food's going to get more expensive. It's kind of like how in, I think it's Luanda in Angola, like Häagen-Dazs and like other kind of food items are like $30 for just a single case of Häagen-Dazs costs $30. And it's like, obviously that doesn't mean that they're starving exactly. I mean, the fact they've got Häagen-Dazs there in the first place, that's kind of, that's all right. But what does it mean? Well, it means that, for example, in the UK, the average person can just go and buy some Häagen-Dazs. Like, I can go buy some Häagen-Dazs and it's not going to break the bank. But in Luanda, Angola, because food is so expensive, because of various kind of factors relating to infrastructure and stuff like that, it means that Häagen-Dazs is a luxury reserved for the very, very richest people. The very richest people in Angola, the people right at the top, they can go to the supermarket or presumably get their maid to go to the supermarket and buy Häagen-Dazs. But the average person can't. So what you really need to do is kind of look, you don't say, oh, it's going to be this horrible situation. You say, like, basically, I think when you talk about it, you could say, well, you know what? People are probably going to have all their necessities taken care of. But luxuries are just going to be done. Like, that's the thing, like, luxuries are going to become prohibitively expensive in the future. And, that's kind of like how I imagine it. And that's what I mean when I say it's just going to be a slightly worse society, where there's just going to be more scarcity because, of course, the, incredibly hot climate is not actually ideal for growing a lot of food and stuff like that. And also, I mean, there's going to be less land to live on. And one of the problems you're going to have is an increasing number of immigrants fleeing from the tropics and heading towards Europe, and that's going to put a massive strain. You think about, it's not necessarily like, and that's kind of my attitude towards climate change. It's not like you talk about society just collapsing, but talk about having to wait an extra 2 hours in A&E because there are a huge number of refugees from the tropics. Talk about, like I say, oh, what if you have to spend huge amounts of money for luxury items and suddenly luxury items become something that only the super rich can afford? Isn't that going to be annoying? Like, that's it, basically. It's just, I think the economy is going to become less productive, because I think there's just going to be, like other things are going to have to be dealt with. People are going to have to invest money in other problems, because I think, like you look, for example, at the damage caused by floods. Like, it's just going to sap money away from the economy. It's not, oh, the world's going to get destroyed. It's, oh man, there's like, oh, that's another cost. It's kind of, it's like when you're playing Civilization and you're just about to do something and then there's a hurricane, it destroys your barracks and you're like, oh, I was just about to build an army there and you got to build the barracks again. It's just an annoying thing. It's kind of like, and that's what I think. You say, imagine like a society, they're just about to build a new school in your area and then suddenly there's a flood. It's not a massive tidal wave that destroys the entire town. It's just a flood that happens because the climate is worse now and we get more extreme weather. So there's a big flood. And suddenly the council, whatever, has to put money towards dealing with the cost of that flood. And now there's no more money for the food. No more money for the school. And now your kid has to keep going to this crowded school where there's like 40 kids in a classroom. And, the teachers don't really know what they're doing because the government can't afford to pay them as much because the government's dealing with all this other stuff. And meanwhile, there's like just, crises all over the world. And there's you've got 40 kids, but next year there's some immigrants coming in from Somalia because Somalia is now they just can't really grow very much food there at all. So they're coming in. It's going to get bigger. It's just going to be worse. And that's how I would talk about the climate. Like if I was in charge of kind of the messaging on this, I would say, and this is why like Greta Thunberg, like I don't jive with Greta Thunberg because her whole thing is like basically accusing adults of like, you're going to kill us. You're going to take the life from our young bodies. Yeah. And it's like, I just don't think people believe it. I think there's just like, people just can't believe stuff like that. I just think there's something in human psychology they hear that's just like, no, it's not. What are you on about? And that's why I think it would be so much more powerful. Just like, yeah, things are just going to be worse. Like, we don't need people to go mental with it. And, this is kind of like why I'm sympathetic to Extinction Rebellion. I'm sympathetic to any organization that finds a good excuse to annoy people. But, Extinction Rebellion, they have this whole thing about like, it's worth, causing this huge amount of, disruption to society because it will encourage people to take action on climate change. And it's like, I think the problem is the very logic there is they basically have to assume that climate change is going to be this massive thing that's this huge like life or death situation. And I just don't think people believe that. And the irony is that, of course, the actual problem with climate change, I think, is just going to be annoying disruptions to life. Like, I think that's the problem with climate change. And that's why I'm against climate change and want to, take environmentalist action. Because I think it's just going to be a series of annoying disruptions that's going to, I'm not worried that my kids are going to have to go out hunting for food because society's collapsed. I am worried that my kids are just going to have, there's just going to be more money. My kids, for example, they probably might not even be able to go on holiday, for example, because everything's just going to get precipitously more expensive until the idea of being able to spend money on going to Spain for a week is just not a thing that the average family can consider. It's that kind of stuff. It's luxuries that I had when I was growing up that I imagine children in the future might not have because, like I say, climate change seems to be causing an increasing amount of scarcity. Scarcity leads to things costing more money, and basically that means that people aren't going to be able to spend as much money on other stuff. People are just going to have fewer luxuries. That's what I'm worried about. That's like my concern. And I think people might say, oh, you're just worried about that. That means you're not really taking it seriously. It's not just about not being able to go to Spain on holiday because, food costs too much money, so you can't afford to go to Spain on holiday. It's about life and death, and you're not taking it seriously enough. And it's like, actually, I think that my attitude is the attitude that would actually connect people. Like, that to me is like the human thing. It's like just things are just going to be annoying. And definitely in the UK. The UK, like, people, I think the main emotion felt in the UK is just irritation. So I think like the idea of just like things are going to get more irritating would be a much more powerful message. So yeah, there we go. That's what I think about climate change messaging. The other thing I should actually say is that I think with the climate, there's like an aspect where people need to not necessarily try to relate it to environmentalism and more relate it to like other things. For example, like creating jobs. Like, it's so easy. Like, people talk about creating jobs, but it's kind of like, when it comes to environmentalism, they then suddenly put the focus on the environmentalism. But it's like, if you want to talk about building lots of trains because, trains are good compared to, for example, cars on the motorway, or, like any kind of massive infrastructure thing, which obviously solving the climate is going to involve changes to infrastructure. I don't see how that's not inevitable. Just talk about how you're creating jobs, right? And the other thing I think you could do, if you really wanted to, and I think, why not, it's worth it, is just like talk about, especially if you're from a kind of more right-wing country, talk about like making the country better. Just go full on like, we're going to build up the country, we're going to make it the best country, like proper like full on make America great again. But it's like you're saying like make America great, and you're like, we're going to make America fantastic, we're going to get all these jobs, these glorious, beautiful jobs, we're going to have just the best infrastructure, we're going to invest in the country, it's going to be a great country. And then meanwhile you come in and you just build a bunch of solar panels. Like there's no reason why environmentalism can't be a populist thing that appeals to the working class, and even kind of like the patriotic traditionalist working class who are in a lot of ways conservative. Just talk about that. And you can talk about, for example, how the public nature of infrastructure is going to increase the community. You can come up and talk about how individualism's terrible, and you can basically go full on borderline fascist if you like, and talk about how individualism is tearing the nation apart, and we need to build up a strong national identity, and relate that to let's have more community-oriented infrastructure. Let's have more collectivization of certain public spaces. Because that's going to green spaces and stuff like that. Because that's just going to make society nicer, and it's not going to be bad for the environment either. Talk about you could talk about how pollution is a poison for the glorious Reich to last 1,000 years. Again, maybe slightly more borderline rather than full on fascist. But the point is, I'm just saying like you don't even have to be like a liberal whatever to like a bleeding heart liberal to talk about the environment. Literally, you can message on the environment from any angle. And I would say message on the environment from as many angles as you can to make it have a broader appeal. And, personally, if it was me, I think I would kind of try to lean into like a conservative framing of talking about how it's going to improve the economy, it's going to improve the society, it's going to break off the shackles of neoliberal globalism, I don't know, whatever. And then I kind of just trust that left-wing progressives would broadly be like recognize that actually the policies to deal with the environment would be good in themselves. Thus, everyone's happy. So let's talk about how to solve climate change. Step 1, work out where the electricity is coming from. Because here's the thing, like, people talk about electric cars and stuff like that, but the reality is lots of stuff already runs on electricity. And the main question is, where's that electricity coming from? What kind of resources are being used to create that electricity? Now, basically, what I think needs to happen here is just each government needs to come together and really just give a definitive answer to, is it possible to go fully renewable on electricity? Not necessarily like cars and all that kind of stuff, but just make it so that all of the electricity comes from renewable sources. And the thing is, I kind of suspect the reason why, as far as I know, no government has given like a clear answer on it. It's like I've never seen a government just come out and clearly say, yes, we could do this, or no, we couldn't do this. And they kind of prevaricate around and just go, yeah, we're just trying to get like more renewable energy in our, electricity grid. Now, don't get me wrong, lots is good. More is good. But the question is, why not all? Because it seems to me like making it so that all of the electricity people use comes from renewable resources would be a massive step in fixing the environment and making things better for the environment. And it also seems eminently achievable. Because, you don't need to have, solar panels on your cars or anything like that. All you need to do is have stationary power stations that use renewable resources. And it's just like, that's so obviously achievable. It's so obviously achievable, by the way, which is one reason why, like, people who talk about nuclear power annoy me, because they're always like, oh, nuclear power is relatively clean compared to fossil fuels, and it's actually achievable. And it's like, okay, but are you seriously telling me that complete renewable energy isn't achievable? Because I see people being like, wind energy could power like 80% of the UK. Solar power could just power twice the UK's energy usage every year. Basically, people are constantly talking about how, like, actually we have all of these different options which produce more power than we even need. And the question becomes, why would we do nuclear power then? I do think the whole nuclear power thing is an example of where, like, people assume that renewable energy is too good to be true, and it's, like, idealistic. So they're like, oh, nuclear power, that's the thinking man's thing, because it's not as bad as everyone suspects, but it is much better than, or rather, it's not as bad as everyone suspects, but it, isn't some fantasy like powering everything with wind. Wind, that's not power. And And the reality is that I think nuclear power is nonsense, and I think that anyone who supports it is just being like I said, I think it's literally like the faux intellectual dude bros power choice or power source of choice. There's like, oh yeah, nuclear energy, man. Oh, the Green Party, they don't support nuclear energy because they're not smart like me. I don't know. Anyway, the point is, what I'm saying is, no, obviously powering the entire country with renewable energy is so easily achievable. And I suspect the reason why no government has come out and actually just given like a clear statement on is it possible is because if they did, you would see, oh, turns out it is possible, really easily possible. And then you'd say that then they would have an obligation to do it. And they don't want to do that because they're lazy. And they're like, oh, we've already got other stuff to deal with. We got Brexit. It was really important that was a big thing we put the focus on now of all times. Oh, hello. Plane going right past. I don't even care. Anyway, I should care though because it's probably using, how could it possibly not be using fossil fuels? I don't think they have electric planes yet. The main thing I see people talk about with renewable energy is like batteries. Like this is obviously a big thing with solar power. The fact that you only get power while the sun's out, and say, well, what do you do when the sun goes down? And the answer would seem to be, well, you need batteries. And the thing is, like, I see people talk about this a lot, and I do think it's probably true that with a combination of different things, you could easily, not worry about the battery stuff. But at the same time, I also see, like, it seems like every month now, I see some kind of article about a new innovation in battery technology that will make it easier to store electricity. And to be honest, you just have to think, like, storing electricity can't be that difficult, surely. Like, it can't be that hard. And you think, like, how many people's minds need to be working towards just the goal of making a big battery? It seems like it should be a very easy thing to do. So with that in mind, yeah, just solar power, wind power, geothermal, tidal power, hook it up to a big battery. It really shouldn't be too difficult. And yeah, that's why I suspect like this thing is the big thing. Like the big question is, are we getting power from stations that are burning coal? And I guess the answer is yes in some cases. And it's just so obvious that shouldn't be a thing that happens. I mean, to put it into perspective, like hydropower is so easily harnessable that I'm pretty sure like lots of countries have built dams to harness power before like environmentalism was even like a massive concern, just because like it's just so easy. And obviously, I do recognize that with dams you end up with potentially other issues, and of course you create reservoirs, which means you lose some land. But yeah, like the fact that dams are so popular shows that, hey, guess what? Turns out a lot of this stuff is just really easy and works. Now, the other thing I was thinking about was like mass transport infrastructure, and something I've always thought for like a long time. I guess the thing is with me, it kind of just seems like with climate change, as with a lot of things, it's just a matter of just have like one clear thing you're trying to do. So that's why I'm putting the focus on saying like, just come out and say, is it possible to have the entire country be ran by renewable? Like have the entire country's power be ran by renewable? And I strongly suspect they would come out and they say, actually, turns out it is. And they say, how much would it cost? What needs to happen? They say this. And it's like, okay, do it. It's in some ways you might say that's a very big one thing, but the point is it's just a singular thing rather than this kind of nebulous like, oh, we're going to work towards improving things. It's like such a wishy-washy language. But suppose you want to do more than just the one thing. Well, the other thing I feel like you should do, and again, this is an example of just like a very easy thing. It's not like there's no, we just work towards it. It's like a very simple thing. And let's say Europe, because Europe's easier. America should get on this too. I mean, that's a whole other thing. But look at what are the most frequent flights that don't cross oceans. Because I think crossing oceans is silly. But most frequent flights that don't cross oceans. And then the next thing you need to ask is, what is the rail connection between those two destinations like? So let's say the most popular flight in Europe is between Berlin and Germany. You say, what are the rail connections like? And basically, you'd have to ask the question, are they like decently fast and decently direct? And if the answer is yes, then you say, okay, we're going to ban all flights from London to Berlin because the rail network is perfectly serviceable. If you want to go, and by the way, for people who don't know, maybe some people don't, especially if they're not from the UK, there is a train that connects the UK to Europe. It goes under the channel. So just say, you know what? No, you can't fly from London to Berlin anymore. There is, maybe there'll be like a daily direct train that just goes through everything else to Berlin. But okay, maybe at some point you'll find that you work your way down. I think a lot of the kind of main kind of places that are quite close to each other, the rail network is going to be good. So you just say, you know what, you can't fly, just take a plane. Some points it's going to get difficult. Maybe, for example, when you start getting to Eastern Europe, you're going to find actually some of this rail could really do with updating. So maybe you every now and then say, all right, we're going to build up, a proper good, we're really going to kind of work on the whole bullet train thing. We're really going to improve these trains and these links. And that's the thing you can kind of just start doing generally. And that's what I mean when I say, like, is it decently fast? You want to, okay, well, look towards kind of bullet train levels would be a nice thing to do. Which obviously, would get it approaching, the speed of a plane to some degree. So, even that whole idea of like it takes longer, which I don't think is a legitimate reason to use planes, which have so much fuel they use. But ultimately, yeah, just make it so it's like, okay, just work your way through the list. It's like the first one, the most frequent flight, whatever it is, boom. Just make sure that rail is a viable alternative that's not too much more inconvenient. And then boom, just you can't do it anymore. Rail's an option you can do instead. So guess what? If you're driving to Heathrow to get a plane to Berlin, no, you just can't do it. Just get a train across the channel into France from Calais. Does it arrive in Calais? I think it's Calais. Boom, maybe direct from Calais to Berlin, and then that's it. You're done. If you want to, also, like, I'm aware that a lot of people go to kind of the islands, like the Greek islands, the Balearics, the Canary Islands. Well, I think probably just like have it so from the relevant capital cities of those places, so from Athens and from Madrid, there are planes, but that actually the majority of the journey is done by train. So basically, really, like, unless you have not very easily accessible islands nearby, I don't really see why your country even needs an airport. Like, why does the UK need an airport? Where are you going? Isle of Man? That's a ferry. Come on, Isle of Man, that's a ferry. Challenge? That's a ferry. Don't give me your nonsense. I don't even think there is an airport on the Isle of Man, actually. So it's a ferry. But sure, yeah, okay. Do you want to get a ferry to the Canary Islands? Nah, that's a bit much. So yeah, okay, get a plane to the Canary Islands. Get a plane to the Balearics. Get a plane to Sardinia and Corsica. Yeah, okay, no one wants to go all that distance, Crete, all that kind of stuff. But if you're Poland, what do you need an airport in Poland for? Trains, it's not a big country. Just get a train. Get a train. Now, of course, there is the matter of transcontinental flight, but to be honest, in that context, I would say just have like maybe not one place, but just like pick like a few places where you can have airports, and the only thing those airports do is take you across oceans, because obviously you can't cross oceans, of course. Just do that. So okay, I say what you need an airport in the UK for. Okay, maybe in London you have Heathrow, and Heathrow it's got one job, and that job is to take you across oceans. And sure, okay, maybe like you could say realistically we're gonna like connect China and India and South Africa by train. Probably not a very realistic goal. So okay, maybe very far away places, but I don't think that trans-European flights should be a thing unless they're to islands. And even then, not all islands. Some islands accessible, I think, more easily by other means. But yeah, I just don't see why we need those. So it just seems like, yeah, if you're going to talk about solving the environment, solving the climate, yeah, just why do we even have a situation where people can just get planes? Especially, it's especially relevant in the UK where like Heathrow's like super crowded. And it's like, yeah, go figure. If people are just flying to all of these other European places, get a train. I guess I've said that enough times. Get a train. And I tell you what, America, use trains. America. Anyway. But okay, let's just say, okay, we've made it so all of the electricity is coming from renewable resources. We've made it so that people really aren't driving or flying on planes anything as much. Because obviously I think planes would always have to be using fossil fuels. Because I just think that like electric motors or whatever aren't powerful enough. So okay, jet planes, they're always going to have to use fossil fuels. So obviously that's why we make it so people don't need to get planes. But okay, you've done that. Well, what's next? Well, the next thing would, I guess, be kind of smaller infrastructure, which, to be honest, like at this point, I really think we're really, climate change is solved at this point. But okay, we want to kind of get into kind of smaller infrastructure things. So the first thing is, of course, that at this point, electric cars become far less problematic because, all electricity is coming from renewable resources. It's fine. But you could say, well, like individual cars, it's kind of nonsense, isn't it? Like seriously, like people have individual cars. It's just an absurd thing, really, isn't it? So within that context, okay, you could talk about, pedestrianizing major cities. Like I think that's a big thing. And again, you can kind of do it of like the logical thing. You say, what are the biggest cities in the UK? And I think this is going to have to be like a country by country thing rather than like a massive kind of global thing. But you say, what are the biggest cities in the UK? And you say, okay, let's pedestrianize at least the centres. Make so you just we'll have car parks around the outsides of the centre maybe, but inside it's going to be you can have a metro, you can have trams, you can have whatever else. But you can have kind of the whole Boris bikes thing going on, where you got like bikes you can hire and stuff like that. I also think realistically, a good thing for kind of public transport infrastructure would be making it so it's more easy to bring bikes onto public transport. Like trains and the tube and all that kind of stuff. So with that said, basically just pedestrianize major cities so that basically it's just much more obvious that you can cycle around them. And you can, take the planes and stuff. Sorry, planes? No, don't take planes around a city. You can take trains and stuff around them. I also think, the cycle paths should probably be big enough to allow, for example, emergency vehicles to go on them, because that's important. But yeah, basically, that's an idea. Now, the other thing is, of course, connecting major cities, because, like that's the other thing. It's not just traveling around major cities. It's going from one major city to another. And again, I would think you can kind of do a similar thing. You just say, okay, well, all of the big motorways, let's make them trains. And also, by the way, let's make trains at least more economical than driving, because that's another thing in the UK right now. It costs more to get a train than it does to drive. So why on earth would you ever get a train? I think really you can make a strong argument that trains should be free. They should be taxpayer funded and free, because they should be subsidized, because that will encourage people to take trains more often. And I think that alone, just being like, okay, there are easy, it's kind of ridiculous, for example, that there are lots of places which even on, I'm on the M1 is where I live is located, which is, M1. I mean, that's a pretty significant motorway. It's actually got one. It's the Primero motorway. So there we go. I'm on that, and yet there's lots of places which is ridiculously hard for me to get to by public transport, and that's just nonsense. How can that be true? Anyway, so basically, fix that. But ultimately, I do accept that this is kind of a bit of a difficult area, thorny, I think would be a good term, because of course there's a reality that while you could, make it so that, say, if somebody lives in London, London is, very accessible kind of, you can move around London without needing a car. You can travel from one major city to another without needing a car. But what about when you need to go visit your grandparents who live in some random village in Berkshire? Suddenly, you kind of need a car, because it's realistically, traveling with public transport is going to be a faff. So, okay, you maybe need and I think, to be honest, the most extreme version of this, I think, would be you'd say, okay, every single major city and possibly even town is pedestrianized. And by that I mean bikes, walking, trains, trams or buses, if you like. Basically, public transport, no individual cars within the cities. And also, any transport you do to another major town or city has to be by train. You could even have a situation where it's like at the entrance to these towns and cities, there's somebody there like, hey, this car is registered to a different place. Why are you driving into here? You're supposed to get a train into here. And, maybe in exceptional circumstances, you could possibly get a permit, but, just make it so that people just don't need to drive, or, well, never mind, don't need to, aren't even allowed to just drive around so casually from just one city to another. But what you could do is you could have massive kind of multi-story car parks on the outside of your city. So, on the outside city, you've got a massive multi-story car park where your car is, and you could go into there and you could drive to the village where your grandparents live or whatever. So within that context, if you want to travel, you don't drive to Liverpool for a city break, you just get the train. But if you want to go and see somebody who is actually quite far away, but in an area where realistically, like, it's not going to be very well serviced by public transport, well, then you have a car. Of course, within this context, you could say, actually, maybe cars should just be a thing like you rent. Maybe it should be like a taxi thing where, there's cars on the outskirts and you can just drive somewhere, buy a car, basically. I think that would be a reasonable system. But again, this is all like very kind of, I don't think that I'm saying that this is the reasonable stuff that I imagine people would be totally on board with. This is like extreme stuff, but it's just like stuff which, makes sense to me as like a way to make it so that, people just aren't putting as much of a burden on the environment. I mean, let's be real. At this point, like if we got to this point in society, there's no concern for the environment. Like we got to a point where you can't even just drive from one city to another because, that's considered bad for the environment. I think we've basically solved climate change at this point. But I still have a fourth thing, which is kind of like the actual makeup of cities themselves. So obviously, if you're doing all this infrastructure stuff, I think you need to kind of redesign cities, make them more kind of, well, I mean, realistically, you can't just like blast in new trains and stuff like that without moving things around. And in that context, I kind of feel like with cities, I do get some enthusiasm for the whole Venus Project thing. I don't really know how famous the Venus Project is to people who aren't me, but basically the Venus Project is this idea of like it's basically kind of just like a planned community thing where it's like, oh, you build society up, in this logical kind of way. It's a futurism thing where you kind of build society up in like a logical way where everything's kind of arranged in like a very utilitarian way. And it basically just makes society more efficient. And the idea with the Venus Project, and this is kind of something which, I don't know, it's it's the kind of thing where I actually do say, like, oh, it's a bit too idealist for me. The idea is supposed to be it becomes so efficient that you don't even need money anymore because it's just like everything's just free because of how efficient it is. I'm not sure about that. But again, like I say, I'm not someone who thinks about these big ideas. I think to myself, well, let's just make things cheaper. Let's just make things more convenient, except sometimes they're not convenient. Like I'm not pretending that getting in your car and just driving somewhere is more convenient. Isn't more convenient than having to, I don't know, cycle to a train, which takes you to a different train station, and then you take a different train, and then, obviously it's kind of annoying. But you know what? It's for the environment. Anyway, what was I going to say? Yeah, so basically you build up these houses, you make them better. Anyway, the way that I imagine houses in the future is like you would have kind of basically 6-story kind of blocks, and each of them would have like 2-story maisonettes in them. So a maisonette, I think that's an English term. It's basically a way of describing kind of like an apartment, but a 2-story apartment. So it's an apartment because it's stacked, it's in a block of apartments, but it's 2-story because I like that upstairs, downstairs distinction. Now, the other thing about it, basically, I think you should have them like organized so that they're like facing each other. They're kind of like, you form these little kind of residential blocks, and in the center of them, you should have a massive public space. Now, I've mentioned before that I'm a big fan of abolishing the private kitchen, and I'm probably going to make a whole video on that at some point. But I tell you what I'm very fond of, and I'll make a video about now, abolishing private gardens. Like, private gardens are my least favorite thing in the planet. I think if I wanted to point to any example of like, if somebody said, oh, you say your main political ideology is being a collectivist, how do I know you're not an individualist? I would say, well, for one thing, I think that private gardens are a load of nonsense. Like, how can people... Like, private gardens are so dumb. It's like, you have this huge amount of space. It's like, a lot of the time, it's actually more than the footprint of your house for this random just green bit you have outside. And what do? You mow it every now and then. You rake the leaves off it. Like, people hardly ever use their gardens. It's like, okay, sometimes you host a party. Sometimes. And then it has some use. But realistically, the private garden is like the most passive thing. And I think most people spend more time maintaining it than they do using it. Which, heck, what are you even supposed to use a private garden for anyway? Like, you could say, okay, well, if you've got kids, they can play in it. Okay, but like, seriously? Like, how many fun things are there you can even do in a garden? Like, I remember when I was a kid, like one time I tried to kind of like have fun with a football in a garden. It was boring because you can't actually kick it. If you kick it hard, you smash into the neighbour's fence and then they get angry at you and then you feel embarrassed and you say, I'm sorry. and they're actually kind of nice to you. So you feel bad about the fact that you kind of smashed their fence. And then the next thing you know, you just go up to the field. Like, of course you do. Whenever we went to, like, go see friends, we'd go to the pavilion. We wouldn't go to their garden. We wouldn't go and play football in their garden, because who would play football in somebody's garden? What sports can you play in somebody's garden? None. So if you're saying, like, you want your kids to play around in it doing what? Like, the thing about private gardens is they're big enough to be a massive waste of space. And yet they're small enough that there's nothing you can actually do in them. You get, like, if you're saying, like, oh, you want your kid to play, no, are you seriously saying, like, every single, and you look at, for example, I remember we had golf clubs and stuff, and it's like, that's useless, you can't do that, but you can go to an actual golf club. I realize it's kind of weird that golf clubs refer to the thing that you hit the ball with, and they always refer to the place where you can play golf. But anyway, like, I would perfectly, be perfectly happy to take my kid to a golf club. That's a great time out. You go to the golf club, you swing, it's really satisfying. You can't play golf in a garden. You really can't play golf in a garden. You've all seen Happy Gilmore. The reality is that there's just, like, the number one thing you can do in a garden is sit there and hang out. That seems to be, like, the only thing you can do, apart from mow it, apart from take care of it, so that you can sit in it some more. And it's like, well, within that context, guess what? These maisonettes have balconies. Boom. You don't need a garden to sit outside. And the reality is, and this is kind of my point, imagine if you actually consolidated all of the space used for private gardens. Like, I'm looking out on my back window right now, and goodness me, just here, like, you could make a great big field just from all of the gardens literally within eyeshot of me. You can make a football pitch with all of the gardens that I can just see from where I am. Fortunately, I'm kind of, I don't know, the lay of the land is such that I do actually get a pretty good view of a lot of people's gardens. And yeah, basically, you could make a football pitch. And it's like, oh boy, doesn't that sound like a better use of the space that is otherwise being used by, like, 6 people? Yeah, it's just nonsense. So the point being, once you have this space being used for something actually useful, I think what you'll find is that you don't actually need as much space as you thought you had. Like, realistically, I think that a football pitch for 6 houses is ridiculous. And, obviously it's ridiculous when it's private, and literally nobody's using it. But it would also be kind of excessive for just, like, actually being land that could be used. Like, if it was a football pitch, realistically, there's probably not even enough people to have a full-on 11-a-side game, based on the size of households nowadays. So, yeah, the reality is that you don't even need that much land. So what you'd probably find is, even once you consolidated all of the land from these, private gardens, because you realize private gardens were nonsense, you consolidated all of that land, you would still find at the end of it that you had, like, land left over. You'd be like, okay, we've got too much land. And I mean, tell you what, isn't that like living in the UK, which, pretty small country, the UK, and it's got like 70 million people living in it. And by the way, I'm in the southeast, in case you couldn't tell by my accent, which is literally the most dense part of the UK. And it's like, you're in a pretty good situation if you find yourself thinking, we have too much land. There's just too much green space. We don't even know what to do with it. And you know what you could do with it? Just start a tree orchard, Like, you now have land to play with. Tree orchard. Something like that. You can have your little kind of park, maybe a little wooded region, maybe a couple of sporting fields, a lake, something like that. You can have in the center of your little kind of community area, all of this green space. I think the reality is that once all of the houses around that place didn't have any private gardens, because private gardens were nonsense, you would find yourself in a situation where you're like, actually, we've used all of the land we've managed to free up and apart from that, obviously you get more land area by putting 3 houses on top of each other rather than just having 3 houses next to each other. So you've cleared up so much extra space suddenly you can just start like a tree orchard, and guess what now? Oh boy, you're sucking that carbon out of the atmosphere. You're making more oxygen. And it's all because you abolish private gardens. So let the record show that I think I've successfully proven my credentials as a collectivist right there. I don't think anybody has ever more enthusiastically ranted about the benefits of abolishing a form of private ownership in favor of a form of collective ownership. I just, like, why would you have a private garden? It's literally, the things you don't even lose anything. What are you even going to say you're going to lose? Nothing. And, I mean, it creates jobs too, because you can have park rangers. Instead of, like, your garden, which you mow for free. What are you doing that for? Park rangers. Love them. Another job. And that's the other thing. Like, you talk about creating jobs. It's so easy. Just like environmentalism is such like it should be such an easy case to make. Just, it literally makes jobs. It makes money. It makes people's lives better. What was I going to say? Okay, yeah. I did just want to briefly touch on like kind of the global aspect, because I'm kind of assuming that we're all living in Europe and the UK. And of course, lots of people point out, but it's China and India where the problems are. Well, first of all, I mean, obviously you have the the US. The US is obviously, it's an issue. It's a problem, the US. I think the best thing maybe would be for countries that are sensible about climate change, which I think right now would include on a federal level the US. I keep getting confused for some reason. Because I think Joe Biden would nominally pay lip service to caring about climate change. And I think, at least with that lip service comes like pressure. You couldn't even pressure Donald Trump to care about the environment. Joe Biden, I think you could pressure him to. Within that context, I think you say, well, at least work on like the sensible states. So kind of like say, okay, let's make sure that we've got a good thing going on in the Pacific Northwest in California, and got a good thing going on in upstate New York and New England. Basically just kind of works like, I mean, there's going to be parts which just whatever. Ultimately, America doesn't really have an excuse not to, focus on the environment, considering they're the richest country ever. But yeah, they've got a lot going on, which is unfortunate. It's worth just mentioning the global south, which is, I'm going to principally think about like India, but also Africa, which of course Africa's industrializing. Like the thing is, I could forgive somebody being a doomer based on the fact that we're worried about the environment. Meanwhile, there is a country of, soon to be billions of people industrializing right now. And it's like, oh boy. And the answer is pretty obvious, in my view, which is just help them out, really just kind of go like, you know what? We'll do the infrastructure. You can do everything else, we're not trying to but the transport infrastructure, stuff like that, the power, things like that, we will help you out. We will really make sure, and the alternative kind of like the on a global scale, helping out, it's like reparations, it's like, okay, we kind of got rich off of colonialism, all that kind of stuff. We will help you out now as penance with some infrastructure. And it just so happens that it benefits everyone else because that infrastructure is going to be renewable. That's, I mean, of course I'm bulldozing it over a lot of geopolitical complexities. But the reality is that I think basically, if anything, it shouldn't even be too much of an issue, because obviously it's not even like you have to tear down. Well, I'm not implying Africa's completely like undeveloped at all, but you don't have to tear down as much infrastructure that already is in place. You certainly don't have to tear down, like in Europe, for example, one of the issues is that a lot of our infrastructure is very acceptable. So it's kind of like tearing it down to replace it with better infrastructure. I can understand why that's maybe not a thing we're, incredibly quick to do. But I will say, I do think that, while people I don't like when people say like, oh, India and China are the main problem, as like an excuse not to care about CO2 coming from the West. Because it's like, well, let's make it so we're perfect, maybe not perfect, but like basically perfect. Let's at least make it so we've cleared step one, that all of our electricity is coming from renewable resources. Then we can start going to India and saying, okay, India, you know what? We've got all of these, solar panel stuff and things like that will help you out. The other thing is, with the global south, it's actually easier for them to use renewable, because lots of places in the global south hardly use any electricity when the sun goes down, because basically they don't need to worry about heating and stuff like that. like a lot of the stuff which, would be kind of more, and also the other thing is they don't have the thing that we have obviously in Europe where you can have like 16 hours. Yeah, 16 hours. I was thinking to myself, that seems like a lot, but no, I'm right, 16 hours. 16 hours of dark in the winter. Like we're at that point right now where it's like just 16 hours of nighttime. And that's how it is. And obviously in that context, well, solar panels, oh dear, you're basically having to power the whole day on energy that you can only harvest during a third of the day. But in the global south, because it's usually close to the equator, even though it's called the south, it's a funny thing, but it's broadly kind of along the equator, they have more like 6 hours of sun. Sorry, 6 hours. I don't know why I said that. That was not even true at all. They have 12 hours. Like basically they have it split evenly. So they have, I think it was because I was thinking that it gets, like in most of the places in kind of near the equator, it gets bright at 6 a.m., dark at 6 p.m. Boom. Like very simple, not any of this axial tilt nonsense going on. So within that context, they get like the same amount of sun throughout the whole year. So that's an example where solar power could kind of work better. Anyway, basically, I mean, yeah, like I say, for every single individual place, there's going to be a lot of complexity to it. But ultimately, I think it's not too much of an issue. Yeah, just to say, okay, let's make it so that we've got everything sorted, and at that point we can start focusing on other places. And I don't see any reason why we can't get things sorted in just like a matter of years if we really cared, which I don't know. Well, for some reason it doesn't seem like people do. Who knows? I did just briefly want to mention like China. I think one of the things with China is they're obviously pretty bad with the whole destroying the planet thing. And the other issue is because they're kind of not on the same side geopolitically to the West, like basically all of Europe and America aren't really that cool with China. There's a bit of a beef there. And within that context, I think that would create like geopolitical issues around kind of helping China out with the environment, or even expecting China to actually care about the environment, because they might be like, whoa, we're not going to, like, I can get why China has a whole thing about, because obviously the big beef at the center of this is the fact that Western nations industrialized using cheap, readily available fossil fuels, and now the expectation is that other countries which are currently industrializing, or obviously China's very post-industrial, but kind of getting up, climbing, growing economies, things like that, they're expected to use renewable energy, which obviously, I mean, once you've got all the infrastructure set up, is cheap. I mean, the sun is literally free, but setting it all up is pretty difficult. And, like a lot of the research goes into it, a lot of the infrastructure, it's all kind of complicated when you compare it to just burning some coal. So, yeah, basically. And you're literally saying like, yeah, like just, hey, China, don't use, and I mean, well, Africa's a worse example, but yeah, like basically saying don't use all of these resources which are underneath you, which actually produce, essentially, they're worth a lot in terms of the actual energy they can produce. Just say don't use them. It's kind of hearing that, especially if you are China, who is geopolitically kind of in opposition to the West, and then China knows that the West literally developed and is as wealthy as it is now and successful as it is now in no small part because of having exploited fossil fuels and how useful they are to produce significant amounts of energy. To say to China, no, don't use all of that coal you have, you can see why it creates issues. But again, these are geopolitical things, and ultimately what I'm really interested in is kind of like the science and economics of it, and like how to actually bring it into reality. And that's essentially what I would do. That's how I would fix climate change. I just wanted to conclude with the fact that I don't even think economically this is that bad. Like, I don't really understand why countries are so reluctant to kind of do this, because even if like you want to go into debt, I think this is one of those examples where like going into debt is the most justified thing you can do. Or like if, like going into debt to pay for a war, that's pretty dumb, because it's like wars aren't good. But going into debt to pay for saving, again, I don't want to use this kind of like hyperbolic language because I think it's ridiculous, but making the world better for future generations is pretty justifiable, actually. And the reality is like, sure, if kids have to pay for a pretty substantial debt, it's not going to be great, but it's better than having to pay £30 for Haagen-Dazs. So I think that's pretty clear. Also, I think in many ways it would make life better. Like, I think the reality is if you showed somebody kind of like a environmentalist futurist society, the kind of society I would imagine. I think there might be aspects of it they disliked, but broadly speaking, they would say, oh, this is much better than the society we have right now. So it's not as if we're saying make life worse. It's actually, I think in a lot of ways it would be much better. And also, just as an aside, it would help with international relations. Basically it's a situation where, for example, we have to support Saudi Arabia because of oil and stuff like that. Basically resources and the need to pursue resources just puts some countries in a bind when it comes to their actions on the international sphere. And to be honest, I think that actually, on balance, when countries are much more free to just kind of act in accordance with, say, moral principles rather than economic pressures, to secure resources and things like that, you're likely to see international relations improve. I'm not excusing, countries which, including the UK particularly, which have funded genocide in Yemen by Saudi Arabia. But I'm just saying that I actually don't think the UK would be doing that if it weren't for the UK's vested interest in, maintaining some influence in the Middle East. And why do they have that interest? Oh, I guess it could be because of oil. So there we go. Anyway, so that's how I'd solve climate change.